Good evening, everybody. It's Wednesday, so that means I'm welcoming you to another episode of Calenda, Attorney at Law, here on the Coalition Radio Network. I'm your host, as always, Calenda, attorney at the law firm of Inman and Torgy here in Coventry. And as usual, I'll be hosting tonight's show, and most importantly, I'll always be putting the law above politics. We're continuing this series where we talk about various legal topics here in Rhode Island and nationally. Tonight, we're going to discuss Governor McKee's latest executive orders declaring a, quote, new state of emergency based upon the so called Delta variant of the COVID 19 virus, and the accompanying executive order requiring all K through 12 students to wear masks in public schools. We'll also touch upon the implications of the vaccine mandate for healthcare workers here in Rhode Island. And finally, I'll address Governor McKee's calls to have Rhode Island Attorney General Peter Nerona independently investigate McKee's Chief of Staff, Anthony Silva, over the quote unquote Cumberland wetlands property controversy. To help me discuss these topics throughout the night is Coalition Radio host and station management, Pat Ford. As always, Pat, I appreciate you joining me tonight, and I look forward to this conversation.
Yeah, it's a wry, cynical laugh that's coming from this Irish Street politician. It's what a terrible turn of events this week. Holy cow! In a matter of a few days, the political tide that lurches back and forth during Tropical Storm Henri has nothing on what's happened and transpired in the last 48 hours. Wow. So, I let me get my popcorn. Everybody get their popcorn, get their root beer, or perhaps much stronger mood ameliorating substance, and sit back, because what's the old saying? We're in for a bumpy ride.
I'd say so. It's been quite an interesting week. I think we'll start right away with one of the newer developments, which was Governor McKee today, after previously stating he did not see any reason why there would be a conflict of interest with his chief of staff over the 45 Canning Street property issue.
Canninggate.
Did not
Canninggate,
as Pat you will call it. But one day after saying he did not see why there would be any ethical issues involved in that, now calls for the Attorney General to investigate his chief of staff, do an independent investigation over whether or not there were any conflicts of interest when his chief of staff transferred his purchase and sales agreement to his son after the Department of Environmental Management, over strenuous objections, approved the development plans, which, Pat, as you know, is no easy task to get around the Department of Environmental Management in these situations.
But by the way, they're just not a department, but they're actually a way of life.
That's actually very true. Having dealt with them myself, and then shortly after that approval was made, Silva's son was transferred the rights to that property, and this apparently was not disclosed in any ethics forms, which are required by public officials, and apparently was not disclosed at all. And now Governor McKee has asked Attorney General Nerona to do his own investigation on this, which is something that I called for yesterday on Twitter when this came out, that oops, we forgot to include this in our ethics disclosure. And I questioned whether or not there was a need for law enforcement to get involved. And I asked if Peter Nerona would be getting involved in this. And according to reports, I believe the word was his Spock said that he would be starting the investigation shortly. So as I said in my statement today, I certainly hope the Attorney General conducts a thorough, impartial, and especially apolitical investigation, and whatever conclusions he finds and whatever evidence he unearths makes that public, and any evidence he finds to support his conclusions is made public, so we all can have faith that the investigation was done in an impartial and apolitical manner, and we can have faith in our public officials. So I'll be interested to see how this one plays out, Pat. How about you?
Well, I'm curious as to why. Well, I'll say this. I'm with the governor's folks probably 4 or 5 times a week. if I were a betting man, the constant resurgence of interest about this story and the steady drip, I believe is driving Dan McKee crazy. And I'm going to take the high road for once. And this is tough for me, as you know. You know, I'm going to take the high road, and I think he just wants to clear the air. I'm going to say that because it has become a distraction. You know, we were at a press conference yesterday, and in the middle of a pandemic, to do what degree is obviously open for debate right now, but in the middle of a conversation about mask mandates, in the middle of a conversation about the appropriateness of hosting Afghani refugees, in the middle of the run-up, if you will, to a special session, which is going to discuss how this $1 billion or so from the federales is going to be spent, in the middle of a crime wave in Providence, in the middle of all the economic repercussions of the corona, in the middle of the debate over the school systems in both Central Falls and particularly in Providence, and the aftermath of the new school contract, in the middle, I could keep going, right? In the middle of it, you've got a conversation about a crappy land deal in the boonies of Cumberland, Rhode Island, that the media has sunk their teeth into because of potential scandal. And you sit in this press conference, as I do, and you wonder how many times can people re-ask the same damn question. Oh, and by the way, did I mention there's a few other things going on in town? I used to be able to do a really good, and it's funny to think about, one of my favorite, if you will, I'll call them rock and roll, but they're obviously rap groups of all time, is, of course, Public Enemy. And I used to do a really good Flavor Flav face, and I think you know the one I'm talking about. I can't anymore. I'm way out of practice, but I think I've got to work on it because it's at moments like this that you have to approach it with some type of humor, because if not, you're going to throw up. Ugh.
You couldn't write this. You couldn't write this series of events. Nobody would believe it. It would be too ridiculous to write a TV series over. But I agree with you in the sense that I do think Governor McKee made the right move to try to, what I would also agree with your characterization of clearing the air here, because it has become a distraction to his ability to govern. Because as you mentioned, there might be a few other things going on right now in the state of Rhode Island and nationally. And I don't think he needs this distraction. If you're just asking me from a personal standpoint, I don't think the governor needs this distraction while we have several of the issues that we're going to talk about, some of them tonight, that need to be addressed, including some of the executive orders that he's issued, and his call to have the General Assembly come back and essentially ratify what he's done, because in my opinion, I think that he's a little concerned that what he's done may not pass legal muster. But the fact that this land deal is getting the kind of press that it's getting, it shows that election season's already ramped up. This is as you would probably put it, pure political porn. At this point, I'm not going to cast any aspersions on Mr. Silva at this point, because I don't know any of the specifics other than what's been reported. And
why would that stop you? This is Rhode Island. You don't need no stinking facts, do you?
Well, as somebody I like to, as somebody as an outsider and somebody who defends people's rights, I'd like to think that before I throw the man to the guillotine, I'd like to see some evidence that he's done something wrong. And hopefully the Attorney General will undertake that investigation seriously and tell us what his conclusions are. But so I will withhold judgment on Mr. Silva or what he did or did not do until we have something other than reports from journalists as to what may or may not would have happened.
Well, but before we move on to the next subject, let's touch base for a bit, if you will, on the importance of the full disclosure of everything involved in the investigation. One of the sadly not so unique aspects of Rhode Island government is that the details are left for the devil. And maybe at a certain point, if the Attorney General, and the late, great Vincent A. Buddy Cianci had a way of saying this, if in fact the Attorney General comes Coco, right, and actually discloses all of the research, all of the material, so that because Rhode Islanders always have. Now let's go back to the investigation surrounding 38 Studios. And actually, this is a great question because, as I remember correctly, you may have spent some time in the Attorney General's office, right?
Just about 12 years.
All right. So, in that case, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because at least once a show of yours, I must say the following words: I'm not an expert. I simply play one on the radio. And so, being a graduate of the Law and Order online school, law school, my JD, and I won't explain that acronym, right? There's a couple that come to mind. But in that case, it was submitted to a grand jury, I believe intentionally, so that they would never have to, or they could hide behind the shield of withholding, if you will, the entire report. How important is it to avoid that trap this time?
Oh, Pat, I'm impressed you were listening when I was talking on that issue. Yes, that was submitted to the grand jury, and that did not have to be submitted to the grand jury because there are only certain types of cases in Rhode Island which are required to be submitted to the grand jury, and those are cases which are punishable by life in prison. And that was not one of them. That was a financial, obviously, that was a financial situation, a public integrity situation, where life imprisonment was not an option. So that I agree with you that the Attorney General's office in that case brought that to the grand jury. As we all know, and again, I'm not here to throw any stones, but Peter Kilmartin was intricately involved in the 38 Studios deal before he became the Attorney General. And as you know, he was the House Majority Whip. And I don't know what the motivations were, but I can tell you that it's an old prosecutor's trick. Bring it to the grand jury, let the grand jury decide to not indict the target of the investigation, and then our lips as prosecutors are sealed. We are bound by the Superior Court rules of procedure, rules of ethics. We can't talk about what happened. We can't disclose the evidence of what happened without an order of the presiding justice of the Superior Court, which, to her credit, Governor Gina Raimondo did try to get, but was denied by presiding justice Alice Gibney because the rules are so strict. And I'm not saying the judge was wrong. She's actually correct by the letter of the law. But if Peter Norona brings this matter to a grand jury, because clearly does not involve an issue of life imprisonment or potential life imprisonment if there was a crime committed here, that to me would signal that there is something that he does not want to have to reveal about the nature of investigation or what he may have turned up, because that would be his way to avoid it.
Right, and that's where I've got a queasy, uneasy feeling, right, to take off on the Eagles, that Rhode Islanders constantly have, because it's always about the cover-up. When it's not the cover-up, it's a cover-up, and in those few isolated circumstances where it's not the cover-up, in fact, it is actually the cover-up. In this case, what I mean by cover-up is we don't know what they're trying to hide. So anyone with more than 10 or 15 years experience of living in this fine state automatically jumps to the worst conclusion possible, when in fact it may just be a petty political payoff. Not that ever happens in the Attorney General's office, right? Wink. That was my stage wink, okay?
Never.
Let me go to slow motion.
Ultra
right.
Slow motion.
That's my slow motion. I can go frame by frame without even the special effects. But that's the problem, isn't it? Rhode Islanders walk away not even just fearing the worst, but believing the worst at this point. That there was some sort of quid pro quo. And that's what can't possibly happen this time. We need to understand going forward that every aspect of this deal, as slim shady as it may be or not, and one hopes that it's not, and with the exception of a handful of politicians who I actually would hope it was, let's hope it's not, because quite frankly, as a state, we need to be dealing with more important things. So I have a feeling you echo my sentiment in this.
I 100% do. I think it would be a grave mistake for the Attorney General to use a grand jury to investigate this. I don't think it needs a grand jury. This is a matter of whether or not he disclosed on an ethics form his obligations. There are civil penalties that are associated with that. There could be criminal penalties associated with that. But but it's not a situation where a grand jury is warranted, in my opinion. And the only reason, and I think you're right. I think the people, when they hear these things over and over again in Rhode Island, their mind automatically jumps to, something had to be shady. And that's not fair to Mr. Silva. That's not fair to anybody else who may be involved in this situation. It's not fair to Governor McKee, and to automatically jump to that. And I think the Attorney General will be doing a disservice to everybody involved, including the people of Rhode Island, if he uses the grand jury to shield whatever findings he may or may not come up with.
Because in addition to this, there is that pesky little subplot here where, there's an allegation. Somebody used the word no-show. I'm not going to say that. But there's the allegation that Mr. Silva, who's according to public records, on the payroll of the city of Cumberland as their disaster emergency management guy, which is, come on, really? I'll just let's throw in one more side of this. You know what would be wonderful? If someone mixed in the word, all right, now Chaz, I want to make sure you're not drinking hot liquids. You're not operating heavy equipment, right? We're good on this. If someone mixed in the word volunteer, according to public records disclosed by one of the television stations, Mr. Silva is getting $7,500 a year to be the emergency management person. Now, Mr. Silva has had a long and healthy, by all accounts, highly credible career in government. He served as the head of the Department of Motor Vehicles. He's served as the registry or whatever, hellspawn that is. He was a police chief of high repute in the town of Cumberland, and now he's serving at the highest levels of Rhode Island state government. One would assume that he's being well compensated for all of that. So it never ceases to amaze me how the hands, though, are always outstretched. Really? You couldn't just volunteer to be the head of emergency management in Cumberland? The six-figure salary you're getting as chief of staff or whatever, again, hellspawn title they've come up with that's not good enough. The pensions you're going to get, again, earned as a police chief for the town of Cumberland, that's not enough. When is it enough for these people? And again, the next time I see the word volunteer will be the first time. How about what are those other crazy words? Give back. Any thoughts on that?
It seems like it's again, not speaking about Mr. Silva in particular, because again, I'm waiting to see what happens with this, but it's rare you see volunteer in this type of environment in the state. Everybody seems to be compensated for something or another. Not that people shouldn't be compensated. I am perfectly fine with that. But when, like you pointed out, you're in several high-profile situations where you're already being well compensated, and you hold a title, perhaps, that you are a town's emergency management agent or a top official, and you're getting a nominal sum, but something additional. Is that not typically Rhode Island, Pat? Because it sounds to me like it's typical Rhode Island politics.
Yeah, I'm not thinking he needs, and again, I'm not thinking he needs the $7,500. At the same time, if it's inappropriate not to pay someone for the job, I have to imagine that somewhere, and again, I always refer back to the wit and wisdom of one Vincent A. Buddy Cianci. He often referred to an intergalactic search that could take place, because I got to believe there's somebody somewhere in the state of Rhode Island who could also be the part-time emergency management consultant for the town of Cumberland. Just saying.
I would hope there'd be somebody else other than Mr. Silva. Not that there's anything wrong with him, but there's got to be somebody else who's qualified for that job.
I don't know, any one of the thousands of highly rated, highly experienced veterans that are living in the state, probably on a fairly mediocre pension, for whom that job would be a wonderful utilization of a lifetime of talents. Just saying. I don't want to obsess over that, but I thought it was important to raise the point.
The point's well taken. It's not limited to this. You see it all over. You see it all over the state where the well-connected get these these jobs, these secondary jobs, or the plush positions that there are plenty of qualified people who are able to get them, but somehow unable to break through that ceiling, or that I don't want to call it a glass ceiling because that implies it could be broken, but perhaps a concrete ceiling in the case of Rhode Island government. So it's worth watching. I wanted to bring it up, and I did want to show my appreciation that Governor McKee is asking someone to independently investigate this. And I actually do sincerely hope that the Attorney General uses apolitical resources to do a thorough investigation and make it public.
But so before we move on to the next subject, and boy, we have a lot of material tonight. Let's talk about process. I think this is a critical point. We often hear about quote unquote special investigations. We often hear about, blue ribbon panels. We often, all the stuff. What is, I don't even know if there's such a thing as a typical procedure on this, but what would be akin to a typical procedure on this type of investigation? Who carries it out? What's the protocols, rules of evidence? From your perspective, how will this most likely proceed?
Well, if I was the Attorney General, I'd have the state police investigate. They're basically the law enforcement agency that the state Rhode Island Attorney General has as its disposal. I mean, they do have the BCI unit, which technically have law enforcement powers, and they have not been used for most administrations that I'm aware of over the last several decades. They have not been used to their fullest extent, but you get the state police involved. They do an investigation. They subpoena documents. They present their findings to prosecutors or attorneys in the Attorney General's office. There are no rules of evidence at this point. It's just a matter of there's going to be a determination made by somebody in that office about whether or not there is some sort of action, whether it be civil or criminal, that can be taken in this matter, and whether or not there's a reasonable probability of success if they were to bring the matter to a court. If they think there's a criminal matter, like I said, they can either bring it to a grand jury, which would be a mistake in my opinion, or they can sign a criminal information or file a criminal complaint. If it's civil, they can take a civil enforcement action. They file suit in the Superior Court. Or they can, the Rhode Island Ethics Commission, they can take their own actions for failing to comply with the rules. I mean, there's a lot of ways this can go down, and it really depends on how much the Attorney General wants to be involved, how little does he want to be involved, and what he's coming up with, or what the investigators are coming up with as evidence.
Because this was requested by the governor, is this a purely political process, or does this instantly take on we're going to determine whether or not there's something criminal here, and take over the decision-making process as to whether a criminal case and or a civil case will be initiated?
Well, the Attorney General is under no obligation to accede to that request from the governor. It's always at the prosecutorial discretion is pretty much absolute as far as whether or not they're even going to bring charges or investigate. But it seems to me, by all statements that were made today, that the Attorney General is intending to do so. So if there is a decision to be made on either a criminal case, if there's a decision to be made on a criminal case, it will definitely be made by the Attorney General's office. If there's a civil action to be taken, it'll likely be made by the Attorney General's office, by his civil division. But if the Rhode Island Ethics Commission is the only avenue that's going to go down, and they issue an opinion, then that would be the more akin to an administrative sanction, as opposed to anything that would go to court.
In your opinion, and just strictly your opinion, so I'm appealing to what I call your political spidey sense, or your prosecutorial spidey sense, right? And for all those who don't know, a spidey sense is Spider-Man. When all of a sudden his spidey sense would go off, his nerves were tingling, and he knew that something bad was about to happen, or something was about to happen. Do you think that the Attorney General's office, as it's constituted now, might have initiated this investigation independently, and did the governor actually just engage in a preemptive strike?
I would say that, if you listen to Peter Noronha and took his words on face value, you would think that they would probably have initiated this independently, since he likes to do that when it comes to public officials. In fact, he created his own public integrity unit just to do that. However, there was no indication that they were doing that until Governor McKee came out and asked for him to do that, because there had been denials up and down that there was anything to even investigate. So, I have to assume that any agreement that was done, and I'm going to give everybody the benefit of the doubt right here, and that's not like me, because as a native Rhode Islander, as we alluded to earlier, I'm not usually giving people the benefit of the doubt, but I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt that the governor asked as perhaps a political calculation to get out ahead of this, and the Attorney General has agreed to do an investigation. It doesn't mean anything's going to come of it. We don't know, but I would think that it's in the governor's best political interests, which, being in his position, he's got to look out for that. And the Attorney General, I don't know if it's in his best political interest, because it depends on what he finds and how he handles it. And he's got a much different role than the governor. Although they're both up for re-election, or actually in McKee's case, election. It would be they both have very, very different roles, because the Attorney General is simply a law enforcement agent, and the governor's a politician in all sense of the words. So it can be a very different calculus for them both.
And this effectively takes McKee to a large degree out of the hot seat, because going forward now, he, from a crisis management perspective, did the right thing, which was to almost immediately, bring the full faith of government investigative powers down upon it. But he also gets to the now infamous response of any politician when faced with a difficult question about something under investigation. I'm sorry, we can't comment on that matter, as is currently under investigation. He gets to say that now, doesn't he?
He does get to say that. He doesn't have to say that, because he's not the investigator. The one who has to say that is Peter Noronha in his office, because they will be the investigators.
Right,
but Governor McKee is going to take that route. I would imagine.
Yeah, but he's been, again, witness yesterday's presser. And there's one tomorrow morning where he is just going to get. They'll still answer the question, except he'll be able to look at them and smile and say, "Listen, in response to your concerns, we have brought that to the appropriate law enforcement mechanism, and it's being investigated thoroughly. Let's wait until the facts come out." Does this sound, by the way, like a standing headline in Rhode Island, right? Let's wait until the facts come out, and then we'll all, using due process, be able to have a conversation about what really happened. Until then, I must refrain from commenting. End of story.
It sounds a lot like what we hear all the time, and people are always concerned with due process when it affects them or those close to them. Not so much so when it affects some people who they may not have such fondness for. So I always love how due process comes into play when it benefits that person who's invoking it.
Right. Well, and let's be blunt too. I think was it Ray Donovan, who was the labor secretary for the Carter Mondale administration, who invoked the now classic response to the media: "Where do I go to get my reputation back?" So Mr. Silva is truly, regardless of the salivating press corps and the chattering classes like us. You're officially part of the chattering classes, by the way. Now you are a talking head. Great. It's something you'd always dreamed of. Some boys dream of playing center field for the Boston Red Sox. I knew it was in your early days. I think if I go back to your high school yearbook, dreams of a future, appearing on local talk radio shows and media. But But Mr. Silva comported himself, I should say, honorably as the head of the Cumberland Police Department, and comported himself honorably as the head of the DMV or the registry. So I think we too need to leave it up to that, and let's get on, if you will, to the matter at hand. Or if I can paraphrase, a wise man once said, "What a revolting development." We have an executive order. Now, maybe can you give us a little bit of, and you do this so well, you make this accessible. Somehow you manage to make this accessible, interesting, and informative all at the same time. But can you give us, if you will, Executive Order 101? How are executive orders supposed to work? You know, you had this first. By the way, I'm waiting for someone to do this as a meme. Have you ever seen the Harry Potter movies?
Yes, I've seen some. Oh, I've seen some of mine.
All right. So did you see the one where it was Imelda Stan, whatever, whoever the woman is who came in and took over Hogwarts, kept issuing the decrees, and I had this mental image of Governor Raimundo, right? You know, standing up on having Lurch or whatever his name was, or Persia or whatever, standing up on the step ladder at Hogwarts or / Halitosis Hall, right, and nailing to the wall yet another executive decree. So how are they supposed to work? How do they work on, in the first wave of decrees, and what's going on here?
So an executive order generally comes from someone like the governor, or in the federal case, the president, to help, I would say, implement existing law. They are not meant to make laws. They are not in themselves law unless the legislature has designated that an executive order has the force of law. And when Governor Raimondo issued her initial executive order declaring a state of emergency in 2020, I believe it was March of 2020, based upon the COVID-19 pandemic, she did so under her emergency authority, Rhode Island General Laws 3015-9. She cited a bunch of other authorities, Article 9 of the Constitution, which gives her no additional authority to issue these emergency orders. And there was another public health statute, but really 3015-9 is what allows the governor to take unilateral executive action to combat a public health emergency or any other imminent threat to the state of Rhode Island. And she did so based on COVID-19. And if you compare the orders that Governor Raimondo issued when she declared the state of emergency originally to the order that Governor McKee just recently issued, which is Order 21-86, which declared a new emergency based on the Delta variant of the COVID-19, the reasons for the emergency and why he felt he needed to take executive action imminently to mandate that K through 12 students wear masks in school, which was his subsequent executive order after that, were almost identical to those that Governor Raimondo had issued in her first order. And that order, to my knowledge, and by the terms of the 2022 fiscal year budget, have not been terminated. So we are technically still under a declaration of emergency from Governor Raimondo in 2020. The General Assembly, at the time when Governor Raimondo was in charge, had the authority to terminate those orders if they had voted by concurrent resolution of both houses. They chose not to do that. So that's why Governor Raimondo was able at the time to continue to issue order after order after order after order. I believe there was upwards of 100 and something orders that she issued alone. We're now in the high hundreds with Governor McKee. And there was the only way that would stop is if she rescinded them or if the General Assembly stopped them. The budget has changed that process. When they passed the budget this year in July, they amended Rhode Island General Laws 3015-9 and said the governor can still issue these emergency declarations and executive orders to protect the imminent threats to Rhode Island, but after 180 days, they have to be approved by the General Assembly by concurrent resolution in order to remain in effect. So what happened was when they passed the budget, they terminated every executive order except for the following. I want to make sure I get this right, Pat, because it's important. except for the following 8 orders. Executive Order 20-6, which was Gina Raimondo's order expanding access to telemedicine services, which is not really applicable to the current issues. 20-19, which increased access to unemployment insurance. 20-37, which I do want to talk about, which because that, I'm sorry, not this one. This is not the one I wanted to talk about, but this simply dealt with the prohibitions on post-retirement employment of state workers, allows them to come back to work if their skill is needed, even though the law generally would restrict that. 20-46, which was amended by 2160, public meetings and public record requests. And this is the one I really wanted to talk about because this was allowed to remain in effect by the General Assembly at least at most until September 1st of this year. Executive Order 20-72, which were the COVID-19 emergency regulations order, where Gina Raimondo allowed emergency rules to be extended past the statutory deadline. So basically, emergency regulations by the Department of Health in this case can be put into place, but they cannot remain in effect under normal law past 180 days. The governor suspended that time limit in 2020 and allowed the emergency regulations to remain in place past 180 days as long as this emergency is declared. But that would end on September 1st unless the General Assembly extends that.
Well, let me just jump in for a second here. How does a governor get to change the rules on an executive order that she controls when the rules were set by the General Assembly? How does that work?
Well, this was my big problem. If you happen to recall, I had taken on a case last year where there was a gym that was shut down by decree of Governor Raimondo.
Yes, I do.
I distinctly remember myself arguing to several justices of the Superior Court that Governor Raimondo's suspension of that 180-day order for emergency regulations was a violation of the non-delegation clause of the Rhode Island Constitution, because that clause was the one and only real check and balance on the powers of the governor when they're acting under the basically acting in a legislative fashion. So the legislature typically cannot delegate its authority to the executive branch of government unless there are certain restrictions in place. There are certain guidelines in place that tell the executive branch how to implement these rules. My argument was, by allowing the governor to remove the check and balance of the emergency regulation statute, which limits emergency rulemaking process to a maximum of 180 days, she essentially unilaterally rewrote the law and eliminated the one and only check and balance on the Department of Health and the executive branch that was in place, because the General Assembly, as you recall, is not meeting at that time. They were not going to terminate her. They were not going to terminate her orders, and the Department of Health had issued the safe activities for covered entities that remained in place indefinitely until it was just recently ended. And that was the one that was shutting down all the businesses and suspending pretty much everybody's, I would call them, their civil rights, and fining people for not wearing masks and not following the social distancing restrictions. That was what was extending past 180-day orders. And that's what I thought was a violation of the non-delegation clause of the Rhode Island Constitution. Never got an answer on that because the case never really resolved.
Is that considered part of the issues surrounding separation of powers, or was that simply a statutory issue?
No, that is a constitutional separation of powers issue, because you have the executive branch essentially using legislative powers, which they ordinarily would not have, because the Constitution of the state of Rhode Island separates the legislative power, the executive power, and the judicial power into 3 distinct co-equal branches of government. And only time the legislature can delegate its authorities if they comply with certain regulations, one of them being that there are certain checks and balances and safeguards to make sure the executive branch cannot abuse the authority that the legislature has given it through their delegation of their legislative authority.
Wow. Yikes, as they say. So now we flash forward.
That means a whole lot of nothing to a lot of people, but it's an important issue because
I think you've explained it in a wonderful, straightforward manner. We have three co-equal branches of government, both at the federal and the state level. And please correct me if I'm wrong. In this case, you've got the not just the potential, but you had the realization of the executive branch basically ignoring the laws set forth appropriately by the executive branch ignoring the laws set forth by the legislative branch. Plain and simple,
And
just
the legislature's standing by, allowing them to do it.
and here the crazy part is traditionally when folks in civics classes, remember those? In civics classes would talk about the executive branch in Rhode Island, they would often talk about it as one of the weakest, possibly only second to Texas in terms of its weakness. And people would nod and say, we got to do something about that. But Ms. Raymundo actually just did it on her own, didn't she? Homegirl just did it.
She did it, and she didn't even bat an eye. She used the Department of Health, the Department of Business Regulation, the Department of Labor and Training. The Attorney General was certainly a willing participant in
Yes.
exercising this executive authority, which he also wields. And it was a absolute, for anybody who is for a unitary executive branch power, anybody who's for that, Governor Raimondo was the poster child for exactly how to accomplish that.
By the way, I used the term willing in conjunction with something else. I say willing accomplice. How about that?
I'm gonna go with you on that. I'm gonna go with you on that because when they were exercising that executive authority and finding people and shutting down business, it wasn't the governor's attorneys who were in court. It was the attorney general who was in court enforcing those laws or those mandates that were not exactly in compliance with state law.
And let's dwell on that for a second, if you will. Folks need to remember that the attorney general, who is allegedly the people's lawyer, was acting in concert with a out of control executive branch who was acting illegally, and he was acting in concert with them to suppress people's civil liberties. Am I correct, Counselor?
I would absolutely characterize it in that way, not simply based on my experience in my case, but that was exactly what happened. It was not any other lawyers. It was the attorney general. As soon as I subpoenaed Governor Raimondo and the DOH director, Dr. Nicole Alexander Scott, to testify based on their affidavits that they had supplied to justify this emergency and these emergency regulations. It was the attorney general who jumped to their defense, trying to get those subpoenas quashed so that they did not have to answer questions under cross-examination in court, in the Superior Court. It was not Governor Raimondo's attorneys. It was not DOH, necessarily the DOH's attorneys. They were there additionally. But when the crap hit the fan, so to speak, the attorney general was the one who entered three of his assistants into that case to fight on behalf of the governor and the out of control executive branch.
Folks need to ponder that, don't they? Folks really need to reflect on that, because if they're willing to do that in such and Gina always loved it when I use these words, arbitrary and capricious matter, and on matters so, I will say, in the biggest picture of government, almost workaday. And that's not at all to diminish the impact this had on private business. But if they're willing to do so on such matters in such a manner, then one has to consider exactly what this attorney general is willing to stand behind. Isn't that a gross abrogation of his responsibilities as an attorney?
It's a violation of his oath of office, not only as an attorney, but as the attorney general. He takes an oath to uphold and enforce the laws of the state. And by simply coming to the governor's defense when there was a legitimate, and I don't even know how arguable it is, but it was a strong and legitimate argument that the governor had usurped the legislature's authority by removing all safeguards from her abusing her power as the governor under these emergency rules, it was my opinion that the attorney general had a duty to push back because he does not work for the governor. He is not appointed by the governor in the state of Rhode Island. In some states, they are. In Rhode Island, the attorney general is an independent constitutional office, and he's elected just like the governor is. And it's his responsibility to make sure that people are abiding by the law, that the law is being enforced fairly and neutrally, and in a way which benefits not only the state of Rhode Island but its people.
Wow. So now we flash forward. It's now the McKee administration. The Delta variant, if you will, is hard upon us. There are projections being made, which, if we're to believe, would lead us to say that in a few short weeks, we will be in the middle of another one of these hot cycles with regard to the Rona. The governor issued an executive order. Tell us about what's covered in that executive order, and clearly you have issues, as they say, with a capital I. Break that out for us, attorney.
I have big issues with it because right now, when the General Assembly amended the law during the budget process, they said that they terminated every executive order except for the ones I just listed. Those will terminate no later than September 1st unless the General Assembly reconvenes and extends them further. So the governor, knowing this, and I think he tacitly acknowledged this when he issued the executive order because he called the General Assembly back to reconvene so they could approve of what he was doing, I think knows that his order probably was issued in contravention of the new revised 3015-9 because it is related to the same declaration of emergency that Governor Raimondo had issued, and the General Assembly has terminated every other order and said no more shall issue without our consent unless there is a new emergency. The governor still retains his authority, as the Speaker of the House said recently, to issue, to protect all Rhode Islanders from any emergencies. But this is not a new emergency. This is the same emergency. This is perhaps a slightly different iteration of that emergency, but we are still under an emergency declaration for COVID-19. Viruses mutate. That's been happening since the beginning of time. The same concerns that Governor Raimondo had when she issued her executive order exist here. So what he's trying to do, and perhaps I'm looking at this in a cynical way, Pat, so I'll apologize in advance, but what he's trying to do is he's hopefully trying to buy himself at least 180 days to get his orders to have the effect of rule of law, because the statute does give those orders the effect of the rule of law unless and until the General Assembly terminates them. And at that point, you're really looking at probably more than halfway through the school year is done. And the whole purpose was so he could take the debate about whether or not K through 12 students should be wearing masks in school out of the hands of individual school districts and make it a universal mandate coming down from the state so that debate could end. Because obviously there's been an uprising amongst many school districts. We've seen it all across the state about whether or not a universal masking policy was necessary for this upcoming school year. The governor essentially usurped that debate, said, I'm going to put an end to it. In my opinion, gave those school committees cover to not to say, hey, had nothing to do with us. The governor did it. We have to comply. And this is where we're at. And because I don't think he had the authority to issue that because of the revised 3015-9, I don't believe that his subsequent order 21-87 has the force of law at least past September 1st, if you're looking at it charitably.
The interesting thing to me, and I'll ask you the same question I actually asked the governor. Do you find it ironic, Chaz Calenda, that the very same school districts, the very same school authorities, the head honchos of said school districts, who are typically in flames the minute the state tells them to do something, all of a sudden sought the warm, cozy embrace of the Rhode Island Department of Education and the Governor's Office of the State of Rhode Island in following these rules. Do you find that ironic?
I don't know if I'd use the word ironic. I find it convenient. I find it very convenient because, as we saw, we had parents being arrested. We had parents being dragged out of school committee meetings for forcibly objecting to these potential mask mandates that the school committees were suggesting that they were going to impose before the governor issued this order. And I think this was all orchestrated behind the scenes amongst RIDE, amongst many of these school districts, to basically plead with the governor to issue a mandate, which would then hopefully buy them time to enforce these rules and penalize those who did not want to comply with it.
Yeah, it's what's happening here in terms of moving parts, quite frankly, in my humble opinion, is shameful. You've got this hot potato. It's been going on since the inception of the pandemic, if you will, that's occurred between a variety of levels of Rhode Island state government. That is astonishing to watch. I'll just say this. No profiles encouraged here, are there? Oof.
Well, hopefully, I'm encouraged by the vote that was taken by Gloucester, the Gloucester School Committee the other night, which seems like they are intent on challenging the governor's authority to issue this mask mandate. And you can be for or against it, but the school districts need to make that choice for themselves, in my opinion. And I applaud the school committee for taking that vote. They're the only ones that I know of who have taken a vote to challenge it. So I would, as a rule of law person who believes that the law should be followed to the letter, should be followed fairly and equitably, regardless of your partisan politics. I do think that somebody needs to challenge the legality of these orders in court and get a definitive ruling on this. Obviously, if the General Assembly comes back in and says, we approve, you may not like it, but they have the ability to do that. And if you don't like that, my advice to people who have been calling me on this all the time is, you voted for them. If you don't like it, you vote the people out who are making policy and laws that you don't like. And that's where this has really become. This has gone from a health issue to potentially a legal issue to now really a political issue. And that's unfortunate because this really should be, we're in the midst of a pandemic. We have so many moving parts, as you said, and to make this purely about politics does nobody any favors, especially the kids who this is affecting, these mask mandates are affecting. A one-size-fits-all policy, in my opinion, is not the way to go in this particular situation.
Now, if you are a practical pragmatist, as you are and so many folks who will end up listening to this show are, we revel in your ability to tell us what the next actual steps are. Part of the challenge on this is, if you're a layman, if you're, again, not an expert, you can hypothesize about, well, what happens next? Of all places, one of the tiniest burgs in our little state, if there was a biggest little right now in terms of heart, the biggest little occurred in possibly the biggest little. And, the tiny town of Gloucester threw down the gauntlet. So tell us in reality, because most of us will just hypothesize and we'll think and we'll try to extrapolate. But what is the next step, if you will, from the town of Gloucester? Do you anticipate, or is your thought that the town of Gloucester, not that you have any knowledge of what their internal thought process is per se, but will they sue? Will the state? And a question that I've asked at a couple of press conferences now: what happens when people simply say no? So they carved out an area in the law in the mask mandate for people who are conscious objectors, I think was their term by the one town councilman. So do you think the state will prosecute? Does the state have the power to prosecute? I mean, how do you, if someone violates a state mandate like this, do you go to state mandate court?
That would be those would be an administrative hearing at the Department of Health, which anyone who's been through those knows what hell those are. That is just simply fresh hell. But it is basically the Department of Health basically could issue citations. They could take an enforcement action against not only the school district but individuals.
Well, explain that for me, because we've all been treated at one point or another. I think there was the infamous incident, it may have even been a Gloucester or Foster, where the Department of Environmental Management, with its shock and awe, took on and successfully invaded a koi pond at one point. I think they broke out the tanks and all that. And if anyone thinks I'm kidding, by the way, I'm only slightly kidding. Never forget, if you live in the western or the northwestern part of the state, you understand fully that the Department of Environmental Management has full arrest powers, which they will remind you of constantly, is armed to the teeth, and I wouldn't be surprised about the tank. So is the Department of Health have its own shock troops? Is it sort of like what is it? You got the Air Force, the Navy, now you got the Space Force. Do they have their own logo? Do they have their own uniforms?
Well,
do they have their own Air Force?
I do believe they have their own uniforms. It's the COVID-19 task force. I'm sure those business owners are very familiar with what they look like.
I was going to say, Keyshawn, can you cue the Star Wars stormtroopers? Because if not, I'm going to hum it. Dun, 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 dun. Yeah. I mean, do they come armed with vials of, I don't know, something of, and I shouldn't joke about this, but I will. Bad Zeppelis. I mean, do they throw it? I mean, what are we talking here?
Well, worse, they come armed with citations that could cost you a lot of money if that's the way they chose to do it. But really, what I think what would happen is if the town of Gloucester did not follow through with the mandate, so to speak, that you'd see a state level enforcement. Perhaps the Attorney General would seek to force the town of Gloucester through civil action to impose the mask mandate as the governor had intended. That would be a very real possibility as well. And I don't think he wants to touch this from a political perspective, because I think that would thrust him in the middle of something he probably does not want to be thrust in the middle of, but he will do it nonetheless, because he's already shown his willingness to be an accomplice, to use your word, Pat, to be an accomplice in asserting this enormous amount of executive power.
Wow. Yikes. So we are at a temporary pause in the action, if you will. Each side contemplating, staring across the, if you will, the barbed wire and the great divide that exists between now municipal, one lonely yet clearly well thought of heroic municipal government. David, if you will, in the eyes of Goliath, for whom there is this almost Orwellian / existence waiting to jump at the nearest opportunity into some type of courtroom, because that's what states do now. They reserve their battles for the courtroom. Ooh. Any guess on what
resources?
Any guess on what you think is going to happen?
I certainly hope. I have no inside knowledge, but I certainly hope that Gloucester pushes back, and the parents who are truly in objection to the state and telling them how to educate their children, that they push back, because there is strength in numbers, and I don't generally advocate disobeying laws, but we're not really talking about a law here. We're talking about what I would call executive overreach. When I don't think parents appreciate being shut out of the conversation. From the parents I probably take about 10 phone calls a day, and many of them are from parents who want to know what they can do and what will happen to them if they ignore this. And I can't give them a definite answer on that. All I can tell them is I will try to assist them in any way possible if there is action taken against them. But you're not going to just see this in the context of the mask mandate. You're seeing this now. There are now emergency regulations in place from the Department of Health. Again, that order is from Governor Raimondo is still in effect technically till September 1st, which suspends that law, Pat, the 180-day period where these emergency regulations can be in effect. The Department of Health has now mandated all healthcare workers to receive the COVID-19 vaccine, and that will people who are not willing to do that for whatever reason, be it religious, medical, conscientious objector status, are at risk of losing their jobs. These are healthcare providers, and there are thousands of them. I think we've seen them out at the State House in the last few days, over the last few weeks, and they're getting bigger and bigger. You look on social media; this group is getting bigger and bigger. And to me, you put a mandate like that in place where the Department of Health is going to revoke the licenses of nurses, EMTs, doctors, anybody who refuses to get this vaccination. And I want to make sure that I'm making it perfectly clear. I'm not for or against anyone making that decision. I think they should be making that decision themselves. But they, and the idea that they're going to revoke their licenses and lose these people are going. There's healthcare workers who've been working for us since day one of the COVID outbreak. From the beginning, they're going to lose their jobs as a result of this. To me, that sounds like a very big public health crisis, at least as big as the COVID-19 scenario that we're facing right now. If we're losing hundreds, if not thousands, of healthcare workers who otherwise would be willing and able to work.
Is the state ready to, and by the way, one of the most compelling signs I've seen recently, there was a protest outside the State House, and it was unfairly characterized, by the way, as being solely the provenance of white men, when in fact most of the people there were women. Most of the people there were as diverse as any group of people you'll ever see in Providence. Most of the people, the group there spanned both from doctor down to, and I shouldn't even say down to, across the spectrum of healthcare jobs, from folks who do routine maintenance at hospitals, if there is such a thing, on up to folks who are doctors. So it is the state ready to actually, in a time of shortage of healthcare workers, for any one of a dozen reasons: fatigue, illness, exhaustion, low pay, work rule problems, any one of a number of reasons. Is the state really ready to, if you will, disenfranchise, to revoke these people's right to work because of body autonomy?
Apparently so. I don't know how well that's thought out, and there are certain other personalities, local personalities, who kind of made that point, I believe, today on Twitter and on their shows. But I don't think the state thought this out very well, because there are more people than they, I think, anticipated that are willing to literally walk off the job or let themselves be fired because they have such strenuous objections to being forced to take the vaccine, not even being given the availability to discuss it or make the decision about what's in their best medical interests in this particular situation. These are healthcare workers, like you said. They range from doctors to EMTs to anything, to nurses to RNs, whatever you want, whatever it might be. I can't imagine a responsible state government that would allow all those healthcare workers, when we already have a shortage, a severe shortage of healthcare workers in this state, and not only in this state but across the country. You already have a severe shortage of these workers. You're going to exacerbate that situation by revoking their licenses or terminating them from their jobs because of this. I have a feeling that somebody is going to have to whisper in either Governor McKee's ear or the Department of Health's ear that you might want to find a middle ground here because this is
Right.
not going to help you. This is not going to help you combat COVID-19, the Delta variant, whatever you want to point to. This is not going to help you in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, it may make things a lot worse.
Oh no, I hear you. Well, wow. What's that old cliche? It's a fine kettle of fish we have here. And it appears to me, from a political perspective, that a variety of the groups involved in this have literally backed themselves into a corner, haven't they?
They seem to have. I mean, it's you look at it from the state's perspective, they're saying nothing. Nothing but a medical exemption from a note from your doctor will exempt you from this vaccine. The religious exemptions are not recognized under Rhode Island state law for healthcare workers, unlike in other states. You can try to make request a reasonable accommodation under Title VII of the Federal Civil Rights Act for a religious accommodation, but the EEOC conveniently, and I'll use that word again, conveniently, has already opined on the wisdom of that, saying that in a healthcare situation, the healthcare employer is likely to suffer an undue burden if they were to give you a religious accommodation on that. So you're up against that in the federal system. So, I mean, you have them who's backed themselves into that corner if you take them at face value. And you have people who are the healthcare workers who have kind of backed themselves into a corner if they're really going to make good on their threats that saying, fine, fire me, or I'm just simply not going to come back to work because you forced me to make a decision that I'm not prepared to make at this point.
Right. Yeah, the concept of bodily autonomy seems to have been lost somewhere in this haze. That individuals do have the right to make decisions on behalf of themselves. Understanding that the science is complicated. But we've got hundreds of years of alleged constitutional rights that are supposed to protect folks from this type of government intrusion and government overreach.
Those rights are only as good as the people
Right.
who fight for them.
Right, and they're only as good as the court system and the willingness of the court system to to look at these issues in a manner that's not affected by public pressure or political pressure, which goes back to, and we're going to bring us full circle here, which goes back to that the folks who represent the court system on behalf of the people of Rhode Island need to be independent of political pressure, don't they?
They do, and that's why we give Rhode Island judges life tenure. So they are free from that political pressure. They are free from that public pressure.
And that financial pressure.
And the financial pressure to rule in a way which is supposed to be consistent with the rule of law. And you would hope that, and I know there are many that will, but you would hope that all of the judges in Rhode Island state court system who have this matter come before them, which are likely to be the Superior Court judges and the Supreme Court justices, that they will understand just how important a role they're going to play in shaping the jurisprudence of this area of law going forward.
Doesn't that also speak, though, to the need to have an attorney general who's independent of political pressure?
Absolutely, because the attorney general has automatic standing in most of these cases to fight for the enforcement of the rule of law. And if the attorney general was truly being apolitical and independent and not partisan, he would take a hard look at what is going on. And I believe there are several areas where he could intervene in whatever court cases or seek redress in the courts in the form of perhaps injunctive relief or declaratory judgment relief to determine what the law is and whether or not our government is actually enforcing it in a legal way. I don't see Peter Nerona doing that. I know that I certainly would be, if I'm elected to be the attorney general, I will be out there scrutinizing the decisions of not only individuals who come before my office, but government actors, state actors, to make sure that they are also following the law. Because as we've heard uh, for many times, nobody is above the law, nor should they be.
Right. What was that story we talked about? The grand jury and bringing cases before the grand jury in order to protect those people? I wish I could be optimistic. I really wish I
could be too.
We've discussed 3 separate areas today, all of which have already engaged in political pandering, protection of the political class, and with much more to come. This story will continue to be written, won't it?
It absolutely will. We have a long way to go as far as from a legal perspective about where this is going to end up, because this is in its infancy at this point.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, again, thanks for breaking this down to us. We've got the potential between a municipal conflict, municipally, and the state of Rhode Island. Quick question about the issue with the municipality in question. In order for them to sue the state of Rhode Island, have they already become an aggrieved party, or does somebody actually have to be fined, arrested, hauled off in chains, keel-hauled, set afire and burning tires?
Generally that's what happens when how these cases get started. But the order, theoretically, if it's in full force and effect, is already having the force of law. So they could be the aggrieved party, because now they have passed theoretically guidance or their rule that conflicts with what would have the force of state law. So they probably, in all likelihood, have standing to challenge the authority of the governor to issue these orders.
Does the imminent danger of someone's rights being aggrieved because of an existing action by the state constitute standing?
It could. It has to be imminent. It does have to be imminent. It can't be speculative. It can't be generalized. And like any other person would be affected by it. Because Gloucester seems to be the only school committee that has voted this way. They seem to have an individualized ability to, or they've been individualized, aggrieved by a decree of the governor. And I believe they would have standing to challenge this, the authority of the governor to issue this order.
Okay. All right. Well, listen. Again, as I say every week that you and I get together. Sometimes you got guests, sometimes you and I chat. Thank you for breaking this out in such accessible, yet at the same time, given the tenor of the state's participation in this, excruciating detail. It's great to have a place to go and actually get to know the facts, not the speculation, not the you want us, boy, wouldn't it be great ifs, why don't we do this, let's do a show. No, this is what you're able to bring to us every week is a often harsh, often unrelenting, but at the same time understandable version, if you will, of what the truth is. And I am grateful for your weekly participation in this. It's we've covered quite a bit of ground over the months that you've been doing this, and I look forward every week when I get an opportunity to engage with you like this, because it's listening along, participating. I guess the term would be mental gymnastics, and for someone like me, I need the mental gymnastics. At the same time, my final thought for tonight is it is not unlike a political driver's ed film, except that every day I wake up and I'm in the passenger seat belted in, unable to reach the steering wheel. So, and yet at the same time, as horrifying as it is, the situation is, it's oddly riveting. And I cannot, in fact, divert my eyes, no matter how much I want to, because of the spectacular flame out that's about to happen literally at any minute. God bless you, Chas Calenda.
I feel the same way, Pat. I wish I could avert my eyes and just kind of put my head in the sand and watch reruns of my favorite sitcoms and pretend like this wasn't going on. But we are headed towards a major, I believe, constitutional crisis, not only on the state level but on the federal level, given the ongoing nature of this COVID pandemic. And I'm just of the opinion that you need people who are willing to fight for your rights, your civil liberty. Obviously, you need to protect people's public health, but uh, you can't do it at the expense of what we've built here in the United States, which is our constitutional republic and the rights that we have, which are unlike that of anyone else in the world. And that's why I do what I do, and that's why I want to be the Attorney General for the state of Rhode Island, because I think we need somebody who's willing to fight for that.
Excellent. Take us home, buddy.
Pat, I always appreciate the conversation, and I always appreciate your insight because, as everybody who's watching this knows, I'm new at this. I'm new at coming on shows and offering my opinions. I'm not new at giving my opinions to people who ask, but I'm certainly new at having people listen to them in a serious way. And I appreciate the opportunity so people get to know me, to understand that I am serious about this, and I'm also serious about what I do for a living. Being a lawyer, I take my oath seriously, and I'm taking my candidacy to be the next Attorney General seriously, because we need an independent Attorney General who's willing to put his partisan politics aside in order for the benefit of the people. So those of you who are looking to find out more about me as a candidate for Attorney General, you could go to my website at CHAS, the number 4AG.com. You can also reach me at the law firm of Inman and Torgy, which is in Coventry, Rhode Island, 401-823-9200. I hear from a lot of you daily about these issues that we were talking about, and I'm sure I'll be hearing from more of you after this. And as always, we will be back here on our next Wednesday with our next show, talking about more issues and hopefully get more issues that are riveting like the ones we talked about tonight. And again, Pat, thank you very much for joining me here on Chas Calenda, Attorney at Law, and I look forward to the next episode.
Good night, buddy.
Good night.